Kazin is professor of history at Georgetown University and editor of Dissent magazine. His latest book is War Against War, The American Fight for Peace, 1914 to 1998. Excuse me, 19... I think it may be still going on. The title of this talk is The Role of Religion in Social Movements. Our second speaker is going to be Ruth Marshall. Her talk is entitled Reconstituting the People, Radical Religion and Democracy in Neoliberal America. Ruth Marshall is Associate Professor in the Departments of Political Science and Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. Her book in progress examines the renewed ethico-political force of religious language in the public sphere and the political challenge that religious revivalism poses to democratic forms of life around the globe. And our final speaker is my good colleague, Professor Gene Cohen. Gene Cohen, his talk is going to be on populism and the politics of resentment. Professor Cohen is Nell Herbert Singer Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. Her latest book is a co-edited volume entitled Forms of Pluralism and Democratic Constitutionalism, Columbia University Press, forthcoming this year. And so without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Kazin.
Can I close this? Good afternoon. Thanks to Gene and to Alex for inviting me, everyone who's been getting food and coffee and setting things up, water. Sorry I couldn't be here yesterday. Thursday is my big teaching day, and they pay me very well and teach very little, so I couldn't really miss that. Should also apologize in advance for saying some things that I've said and written about before. Populism is an evergreen subject. We've had populisms with us in the Western world, at least for over 2 centuries, and we'll probably have for another 2 if human race lasts that long. And of course, religion has a far longer history. Populism has become, especially more recently, since it's been in the news and there have been all these conferences, and we've had populisms everywhere from the Philippines to Washington, D.C., and everywhere in between. It's become even more of an essentially contested concept than it was before. So my definition of populism, which I'm using here in this talk, basically is a very simplistic one. It's a rhetorical one. For my purposes, populism is the way in which activists, other speakers, writers, artists oppose the interests, values of the virtuous majority, usually hardworking, patriotic, usually, but not always, God-fearing, against the immoral, corrupt, often unpatriotic elite. That's it. A lot of different definitions of populism out there. 2 excellent books came out in 2016, one by my friend John Judas, one by Jan Werner Muller, a very smart political scientist from Princeton, who took completely opposite definitions of populism, but both fascinating books. But if we can have millions of books on democracy and freedom and liberty, we can have millions of books on populism. So let a million populisms bloom. Anyway, what I want to do is a very, I hope in 25 minutes, I'll try to keep it to that, a very historical thing, historian's thing, I should say, which is I'm going to give a talk about periodization. Now you can all leave after you heard that term. What I mean by that is I want to try to give you a periodization of the relationship between populist passion and passionate religious belief in the history of American social movements. And also finish, since this is supposed to be about contemporary populism, discuss what the relationship of the two is today, what the relationship is between populist passion and religious passion. I think we can identify, or I would identify, I don't like the royal we, 3 sequential periods in this relationship. First, the era of evangelical Protestant supremacy, which arguably lasted from the beginning of modern social movements in the United States in the middle of the 19th century up until through the 1920s. Second, an era of more ecumenical religiosity, which dovetailed with populist talk, which lasts, I think, until sometime in the 1990s. And then the most recent period in which we're still living, in which I think religious identifiers are increasingly tangential or even absent from most populist rhetoric. Activists who claim to be doing God's work more and more describe themselves not as representatives of the people, of a vast virtuous majority, but as an embattled minority. Even as some people have argued, they are practitioners of identity politics as much as any racial minority or sexual minority group has been. Now, this is not true in Europe, and this is about American populism and religion, so we haven't talked much about what's going on in Europe. In Europe, I think there's been probably an increase, an expansion in the connection, the melding between religious passion and religious identification and populist rhetoric. You can see that in Hungary, you can see it with the National Front in France in many ways, and some other countries as well. But I think there's been something of a disconnection in the United States in the last 20 years or so. So let me lay this out a little bit, and I hope this will be controversial. If not, I haven't done my job. The first period began in the mid-19th century, lasted until the 1930s. This was the era when native-born Americans, most native-born Americans, belonged to an evangelical Protestant congregation. Or if they didn't belong to one, they identified as evangelical Protestants. They were Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, in the early 20th century, Pentecostalists. Social movements with a variety of ideologies and issue orientations all spoke themselves as representing a people they identified quite explicitly as Christian, against an elite they scorned as immoral, corrupt, unchristian, and ungodly. Most of the original populists can be described this way. Most of them were evangelical Protestants. In many of the, not in the national party, but many of the state people's parties, endorsed prohibition, endorsed women's suffrage, which was closely connected to prohibition at that time. It's not an accident that the most important prohibitionist in the country in the 1890s, Frances Willard, the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was at the first populist convention, National Populist Convention in St. Louis on Washington's birthday, 1892, though she later left the party because they were unwilling to endorse prohibition and women's suffrage. And the opponents of the original People's Party were quick to identify and denounce the pietistic moralism of the Farmers Alliance, which was the precursor to the People's Party, and then the People's Party itself. Here's a quote from Senator John Ingalls, a Republican senator from Kansas, who was very opposed to the populists, and they were opposed to him. He said about, referring to the populists, "The Decalogue and the Golden Rule have no place in a political camp." Well, the populists heard him say this kind of thing, and they mobilized to throw him out of office and elect one of their own. Jacob Coxey, who, as most of you probably know, put together a rather ragtag, but in some ways inspiring, army of unemployed men to march from Ohio to Washington, where they were going to demand public works jobs from the government. In 1894, he called Coxey's army the Commonwealth of Christ. And he warned the movement that he spawned would either mark the second coming of Christ or be a total failure. It was a total failure. Other prominent figures of Gilded Age radicalism, like Edward Bellamy, Henry George, George Herron, Christian socialist, Frances Willard, I've mentioned before, all drew a very sharp line between the God-fearing moral majority, they didn't call it the moral majority, but they might as well have, which they claimed to represent, and the money changers who had invaded and sullied the temple of the Republic. Of these figures I mentioned, only Henry George really reached out in any serious way to non-Protestants. He was beloved among Irish Catholics because of a lot of support he had for the Irish Land League. I won't go into detail about Henry George, but and he had a lot of support from Irish Catholics when he ran for mayor of New York City in 1886, a race many people thought he was actually going to win. But the other figures didn't really speak in any kind of ecumenical way, and their backing, for the most part, was from people who shared their religious views. And this kind of rhetoric, this kind of Christian evangelical populist rhetoric was quite common among prohibitionists. Even after Frances Willard's injunction to do everything as a prohibitionist, that is to help raise minimum wages, to try to reform prisons, was thrown away by the Prohibition movement. And the Prohibition movement becomes a single-issue movement by the early 20th century, which is one of the reasons it was so successful at getting Prohibition written to the Constitution. But it's taken over by the Anti-Saloon League, which was an organization of Protestant ministers, led by Protestant ministers. But their language was quite populist. Their foe, contrary to popular wisdom, was not individual drinkers who they saw as victims. Their foe was the liquor traffic, the liquor trust, who they believed was corrupting politicians, seducing working men into ruining their families. The Anti-Saloon League raised money in part by passing around the collection plate on what were called Prohibition Sundays, or Anti-Saloon Sundays. And that's one of the ways they were able to finance their movement. A little piece of rhetoric from an Anti-Saloon League affiliate, the Texas Baptist Convention in 1911. There is but one side to the question as to the attitude of any Christian man and thoughtful citizen concerning the liquor traffic. Ceaseless and truceless hostility against the entire liquor oligarchy, local, country, state and national, root and branch. And of course, they succeeded in amending the Constitution. Now, anti-Catholicism was an important part of the rhetoric of some of these prohibitionists because, after all, most Irish Catholics, German Catholics, Polish Catholics were opposed to prohibition. The hierarchy of the church was sort of unofficially opposed to it. Very hard to find Catholic prohibitionists in America. But anti-Catholicism was an important element, I think, of Protestant populisms in the Gilded Age and even into the early 20th century. Example from a biography he wrote of William Jennings Bryan. During the 1908 presidential campaign, the last time Bryan ran for president, some Catholics during the campaign had spoken kindly of William Howard Taft, who was running against Bryan, because Taft, in an earlier stint as Governor General of the Philippines, had negotiated the quite lucrative sale of huge tracts of land in the Philippines that were owned by various monastic orders. Monastic orders made a nice profit from selling their lands. By this time, the Philippines was an American colony. After Taft was elected, many of Bryan's supporters thought that wouldn't happen. They couldn't believe that a pro-Catholic politician was going to be elected president of the United States, though Taft was no Catholic. He was sort of a weak Unitarian. Bryan didn't stoke this anti-Catholic sentiment at all, but there was sort of a grassroots anti-Catholic populism, which a lot of letters came pouring into Bryan's office in Nebraska. And these letters charged quite explicitly the Vatican had ordered Catholics to vote for the GOP. That's why you lost, they said to Bryan. One correspondent to Bryan, how can it be said that our elections are free when one man in Rome can dictate the choice of voters in this country? The election was stolen by the Pope, in fact. Now, radicals were not immune from this kind of populism. Eugene Debs, great American socialist, around the same time called on his socialist comrades to, quote, expose the American Catholic hierarchy as, quote, the rottenest political machine that ever stole the livery of heaven. But I think it was the moral panic of the 1920s, which both was the heyday of anti-Catholic populism and also began its decline. And there, Rick mentioned Linda Gordon's very good recent book about the second Ku Klux Klan, and she talks about this. And there's a huge scholarship, by the way, about the second Ku Klux Klan, which is really worth looking at if you're interested in the connection between populist language and religious passion, especially evangelical Protestant religious passion. Second Klan had 4 million members at its height in the mid-20s, but by the early 1930s, it was down to about 100,000 members, and many of them were hidden members. They didn't want to make public their membership because the Klan had fallen into such disrepute. one of the perhaps the most important tasks that the Second Klan set for itself was to enforce the Prohibition Act, the Volstead Act, which was the enforcement mechanism of the 18th Amendment. So the Klan, for all its rottenness, was actually trying to enforce the law. Of course, doing it in vigilante ways, tarring and feathering people who were found with liquor in the homes and so forth. But the kind of moral panic that the Klan represented, I think, was in some ways a sign that this kind of evangelical Protestant populists were on the way to losing to a more religiously pluralist, more culturally modernist culture in America. In the 1930s, the second period, brought a different kind of religious populist mobilization that was much more ecumenical, both on the left and the right. One example, Father Charles Coughlin, who in the first years of the Great Depression had the most popular weekly public affairs show on the radio, with as many as 30 million listeners from all Christian denominations, Protestant and Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox, and some Jewish ones as well. He liked to swirl religious metaphors into nearly all his attacks on what he called financial slavery, which he called, and notice the noun here, the ancient heresy of the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Franklin Roosevelt talked about driving the money changers from the temple, but Father Coughlin did it every Sunday. This was not an optional metaphor for him. But on the left, there were many pro-labor priests, bishops, in industrial cities and towns who were giving strong support to the unions of the CIO, and many of them did so by quoting the labor encyclicals, Rerum Novarum of 1891, Quadragesimo Anno of 1931, which is 40 years after the Rerum Novarum, which was the original labor encyclical. Now, Coughlin and the CIO priests applied these in quite different ways. But they showed, I think, that these were Catholic populist speakers who were right out front in the American public dialogue. And that was quite new. And of course, they had followers from, at least they were speaking for people of different religious faiths, not just Catholics. Now, as you probably know, Coughlin became a fascist sympathizer, an explicit anti-Semite by the late 1930s, and he flamed out by the time World War II had begun in Europe. His bishop basically silenced him. But a new populist right, often led by Catholics, began to grow once the Cold War began. Now, it's not as if anti-Catholicism went away. Both secular liberals, conservative evangelicals still accuse Catholics of harboring a dual loyalty, not so different from that of communists. But most Protestants had grudgingly come to accept Catholics as good Americans. Joe McCarthy's support in the early 1950s bridged the divide of the Reformation. And such pillars of the church as Bishop Fulton Sheen, had a big TV show in the 1950s, Cardinal Francis Spellman, the dean of the Catholic Church since he was the Archbishop of New York City. They played leading roles in the national purging of the Red Menace. In many ways, evangelical Protestant anti-communists were following in their train. The anti-communist movement, which was indeed a grassroots movement, at least during the 50s and early 60s, and Rick has written about this in wonderful detail in the first volume of his tetralogy, was, I think, a precursor of the moral majority in many ways. It wasn't called the moral majority, but the language of people like Fred Schwartz and his Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, Pillar James Hargis, and McCarthy himself was very much, I think, intended to make clear that there was this religiously motivated anti-communist people who were opposing this elite in the State Department, the Democratic Party, who were in league with communists in the Soviet Union. One example of this from my book on populism, I love this quotation. This is sort of grassroots anti-communism with a very religious overtone. A woman named Josephine Baker, who was a young Irish Catholic housewife from Buffalo, New York, 1951, led a campaign to drive pro-communist petitioners from her neighborhood. The petitioners were there was a Soviet peace pledge, which the Soviet Union and his allies were pushing around the world in the early 1950s. And they were going into neighborhoods, which were strong union neighborhoods in Buffalo, steelworkers communities, and trying to get people to sign them. The Communist Party had been fairly strong in the steelworkers, at least during World War II in the 1930s. No longer was, but they thought they would get some support for some of these people. Well, Josephine Baker made them think differently. And this is what she said about the movement she put together of a couple thousand people to drive these petitioners out of her neighborhood. She said, "I guess I just got my Irish up. I made up my mind if they had the nerve and gall to come into our project, we could show them how we felt about it. We were a small group, but everybody worked hard. We didn't have any money, and none of us held public office. We wanted to keep it on a high plane, pro instead of anti. And we wanted it to be a grassroots, non-political, spiritually based effort. We enlisted the support of priests, ministers, and rabbis. Democrats and Republicans worked together." Now, of course, they were basically running a campaign against a petitioner, which is expressly against the First Amendment, but that didn't matter so much. By the way, this story about Josephine Baker and her anti-communist crusade was in the American Legion magazine. Talk about militarism. Okay, third period. The Christians' rights influence, I think, passed its peak in the late 80s and early 90s. And one of the transition points here, I think, can be seen as the response to the Clinton scandal. When, of course, Clinton's impeached but not thrown out of office by the Senate. Famously, Paul Weyrich and some other conservatives basically said, Paul Weyrich said, the Catholic evangelical, in effect, basically said, "We are no longer a moral majority," end quote. And he called for what is now called the Benedict option in many ways. Let's withdraw and put together a seriously, internally cohesive set of Christian communities and not worry about politics. Neither in the 1990s and now, neither the two most significant conservative candidates for president who railed against the establishment in populist ways, Ross Perot and Donald Trump, identify strongly as Christians. Bernie Sanders, the most successful populist talking politician on the left today, is either an atheist or he just doesn't care. Probably the same thing. Trump's religiosity is clearly inauthentic, but it doesn't really matter to most of his evangelical supporters, as we know. But the only, besides saying nice things about Billy Graham, which anybody would say, the only way which is trying to sort of play the religious populist card that I can think of is saying, now we can say Merry Christmas. But I can't think of much else. Meanwhile, the Christian right has become increasingly less ecumenical in reality, if not in doctrine. Protestant evangelicals outnumbered Catholics in the right to life and anti-gay movements and have become its most visible leaders, even though the right to life movement was begun by Catholics, and they were the major activists in it until the late 1970s. Increasingly, the Christian right's claim to represent a moral majority has been replaced by its self-image as a defender of minority rights against the wave of secular amoral culture that is sweeping the nation towards hell. So it's a form of identity politics, which by its nature is the very opposite of a populist stance. So where are we? I'll finish up with this. I was going to quote Peter Steinfels, the liberal Catholic writer who said some wonderful things, I think, about what he calls the victory of soft secularism, which I think in some ways trumps, shouldn't use that as a verb, but trumps what we think of as this battle between believers and non-believers, between sort of the ACLU left, if you will, and the religious freedom right. I think most people, unlike most periods in the American past, don't really care that much. That's especially true of young people, for whom this religious passion connected to politics, at least, they just get it, They could be religious or they could be politically passionate, but they don't see the two as being good together for the most part. We may never resolve the question of what role religious beliefs play in our politics. Millions of Americans can't bear to give up the ideal of a godly people. Other Americans view that ideal as hostile to a secular pluralism, like that represented by the ACLU. But religious populism will probably become more and more of an oxymoron with every passing year. Whether or not that's a good thing depends on your view of moralist rhetoric, which I think is both inherently inspiring and inherently divisive. But there we are. Thank you.
Professor Marshall.
Hello. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm sticking my neck out a little bit. Anybody who knows me knows that I spend most of my career working on Pentecostal or charismatic Christianity in Africa. And for the last 3 years, I've become obsessed with what's going on in the U.S. And it's become a personal obsession. And so I decided, well, if I'm spending all this time in these nether regions of the internet and visiting these, I went to the Values Voters, for example, last year, I might as well make it my research. So it is not my main field, but I do feel that it's an urgent matter and an urgent question that all of us who are thinking about religion and politics should be engaged in. So I'm going to do my best to sort of give an account of what I see are the most recent developments on the religious right and thinking about how it has to do with populism. And I'm going to start with an opening gambit, which is a question about whether the political system today in America is still worthy of the name democracy, whether what we are observing, and arguably for some time, is the degeneration of democracy into oligarchy, as Aristotle saw. This is the perverted form of democracy. And at least we can see how the agents of financial capital are now wielding real political power in a way that's really obvious, even if it wasn't under the Bush regime. It definitely is now. The election of Donald Trump, who's not only epitomizes global capital, but is himself an actual brand in his own person to the world's most powerful political office, is the most overt manifestation and symbol of this phenomenon, I think. So this poses the question of the role of populist politics in this process of what I would call this process of degeneration. And I want to look at the ways in which changes in evangelical Christianity, because, you know, we've been saying evangelicals for the last 2 days as if it was a homogeneous group of people that represent a single set of opinions and views and theologies and political theologies in particular. And I'm really interested in a particular section that's become the most militant and prominent and is growing the fastest within the evangelical community, which we could call the third wave renewalist, charismatic, Pentecostal, which is post-denominational. It's often been called also networked Christianity, and the way in which this new movement or new wave intersects with politics in neoliberal America today. And we know that since at least the 1980s, the religious right has played a significant role in achieving what we could call far-reaching identitarian and effective realignments of power, transforming institutions so that they facilitate and sustain new forms of symbolic identification and new political subjectivities. So an open question for me is how to define these most recent developments that I'm going to try and detail rapidly, because it's a 32-page paper, and I only have 25 minutes. But in religious right politics, in terms of populism, there are new connections between networked, charismatic religious leaders, political and financial elites, a populist rhetoric and style of persuasion. So if we think about populism as being sort of fundamentally defined by the opposition or a cleavage between popular and elite politics, or we can think about it as anti-systemic. It's an open question to me, given the close connections between a populist form of persuasion and evangelical or a charismatic epistemology, and the kind of money and elite connections and the kind of coalition that's being built across a broad spectrum of elite political and economic actors, right? It is clear, though, that part of this story is about trying to reconstitute the people along a particular political line, in a particular political theological line, right? So it's this idea of America as a Christian nation, a new form of, American exceptionalism and Christian reconstructionism, even. And to what extent this is a populist movement. So I don't really have a good answer to this, so you can ask me questions. I mean, Canadian political theorist John Ralston Saul, speaking about the neocons, called them the Bolsheviks of the right, and said that they had the methodology of Bolsheviks, right? An elite group working out how to get power and keep it. And I wonder if this might not be a good way to talk about this new constellation or coalition that I'm going to talk about. rather than populism. I'm not really sure, but there was a populist element, of course, to Bolshevism, but it was also based on this idea of a vanguard and an elite group. So focusing on the recent developments in the contemporary religious landscape, where the institutional forms of the church, or what we understand as denominationalism, which is so prominent in the historiography of American Christianity, and really has overdetermined, I think, in many ways, the way we look at the field of Christianity in the States, has been superseded by new forms of network communities and the rise of a relatively elite group, or self-styled elite group, of new charismatic Christian authorities whose connections to these old institutional forms of the church, the congregation, the local community have been replaced by this entrepreneurial model of networked individuals and the construction of virtual mediated communities of global reach and significance, right? So these, while they're American and they're focused on America, they are also very much involved in these global networks. And so these networks are not just American, but they are actually constituted, and they have a global evangelical project at their heart. And that aspect is important. I won't be able to talk about it in the time today, but if you want to ask me about it, we can talk about it in the questions. So there's shifts in modes of mediation, the circulation of discourses and images on social media, these new media-created publics, alternate reality publics, begs the question of the relationship between the leaders and the people, who these people are representing, right? The question of their not just religious legitimacy, but also political legitimacy. Jonathan Albright's talk earlier, the economic forces driving democratic opinion and will formation, technology versus media companies. We can see in the ways in which these developments shore up a neoliberal regime of oligarchic power and a shift in the epistemic grounds of political mobilization and opinion formation. Creation of new mythologies that aim to capture the people and whose performative force develops a new engaged and militant political subjectivities. So Sheldon Wolin, who's one of my favorite political theorists, in his last book, which was really very depressing, sees clear signs in 2006 already about the role of big money in politics, the credibility of popular news media, the reliability of voting returns, and he calls what he calls inverted totalitarianism, which in contrast to earlier totalitarianism, fascism, Stalinism, which focused on the state, this new form, while exploiting the authority and resources of the state, gains its dynamic by combining with other forms of power, especially evangelical religion, and most notably by encouraging a symbiotic relationship between traditional government and the system of private governance represented by the modern business corporation. So the result is not, according to Wolin, a system of co-determination by equal partners who retain their distinctive identities, but rather a system that represents the political coming of age of corporate power. And he anticipated that critics were going to dismiss his book as a fantasy, right? So seen over a decade later, I think it reads rather prophetically. And I'm really glad for his sake that he passed away 2 years at the age of 93 before Trump came into power. I think that would have been really hard on him. So while the genealogy of democratic rot goes further back, I'm going to focus, we can focus, Wolin and focus on the pivotal shift that happens in the U.S. post 9/11. And what he calls a cultivation of fear, a mobilization of war, a virtual and perpetual war, right? It's not an actual war in America, but, and also a shift in the epistemic grounds of democratic practice. So this is my edition, where myth-making takes the place of reasoned deliberation if, and this is a big if, right, that such a Rawlsian characterization was ever really apt, which I doubt, myth-making that is served to manage a passive, demobilized, and manipulable citizenry. So one of the things that I think does help account for the efficacy of right evangelical religious mobilization and organization has been its capacity to participate in this myth-making project that he identifies. Again, it's an open question to what sense we can call it populist, with respect to this long tradition of popular religion in America. And also with respect to the tendency today to see populism as a kind of contemporary euphemism for bad or perverted democracy. But if we think that politics, what politics should be, or is, or should be about, according to Wolin, about the res publica, the common, the shared world, its values, its direction, and if democracy has at its fundamental core this paradoxical relationship between freedom and equality, where the place of power is empty, in the words of Claude Lefort, where power cannot be incorporated, so that popular sovereignty does not mean that the people as a unified whole, a single body with one voice. And even the act of naming the people contains the seeds, if it is uncontested, of totalitarianism. So for me, it's not so much the question of inclusion and inclusion, exclusion, because by definition, any demos must be defined by what it excludes. The question is, for me, about the equality amongst the included and the possibility of expanding inclusion through a greater focus on equality. So a working definition of populism, which I kind of brought up yesterday, might help us rethink the problem by focusing on what Bonnie Honig calls the paradox of democracy. So every day, democracies face the problem, which is theorized by Rousseau, that's posed by the mutual inhabitation of the people and the multitude. At once, there's supposedly a people that has a constituting power, a constitutive power, and a multitude of just the mass, the unconcerned, the unpoliticized, the people who act in civil society according to their egoistic interests. And the effects of this undecidability between the people on the one hand, as a political agent, and the multitude on the other, the effects of this undecidability on democratic politics. So for me, popular sovereignty means that isn't it simply a matter of an initial founding or a constitutive power that happens at the origin, right, Declaration of Independence, but an ongoing power not to simply legitimate forms of representative authority, not just to be a plebiscite, but to affect realignments of power and to force institutional changes, right? But we know that the popular sovereignty is a form of the ongoing formation of the people as a political agent, and the exercise of its power can cut both ways. It doesn't necessarily lead in more democratic directions. In order for this to not degenerate, the people must remain a plural heterogeneity. And democratic politics must be defined by a fundamental agonism and contestation, right? So to engage in political activity is, by definition, a partisan matter. I mean, Claude Lefort says the most important right democracy institutes is the right to question the principle of right, which means that constituting power has to be ongoing. And as Honig says, the form of the people must remain unstable, contestable, to be remade every day. Democracy is a form of politics that is always in emergence in response to everyday emergencies of maintenance. So that would be my kind of take on populism at a very abstract, kind of theoretical level. So I'm going to turn now, though, to this question of these new kind of Christian charismatic authorities, and thinking also particularly trying to focus on their political theology. And I want to push back against the idea that it's something that we could characterize by a kind of contrast between Amos versus Leviticus. If we look at evangelicals in those terms, I think it's potentially much more complicated than that. And I want to think about the effective and performative rhetorical aspects of in these new evangelical charismatic Protestantism in America, given that there's a great deal of political theological ambivalence. Right? On the one hand, you could argue that they can easily lend themselves to a kind of authoritarian political theology that upholds the power of the state and of authorities. But on the other hand, it certainly is the case that Pentecostal political theology is quasi-democratic in its form. And I have made an argument in my book that, in fact, I would call Pentecostal political theology a negative political theology, insofar as it fails to enable stable forms of community or legitimate stable forms of sovereignty. However, I think it can be mobilized, and it is being mobilized in the service of another, as a kind of supplement or a support for an authoritarian, potentially authoritarian project. It's a performative power of speech in particular that makes this form of charismatic Christianity so powerful and so potentially dangerous. As Derrida says, when performatives succeed in politics, their truth sometimes imposes itself forever. So two aspects that I talk about in the paper, and Althea is somewhere over there. I'm not going to talk about the prosperity gospel. It's really interesting, and it does make a stronger case for why these forms of Christianity are actually very much in line with kind of neoliberal thinking about economics. But I'm going to talk about the other important part of this group, which is the paradigm of global spiritual warfare and its prophetic temporalities, right? So it's got the paradigm of global spiritual warfare in the end times is a kind of Exodus story of a sort. It's apocalypticism, right? And what is apocalyptics if not an exit from the world as it is? And there are various versions of this, right? there are authoritarian or dominionist versus what I would call quasi-democratic conceptions of an apocalyptics. They take different forms in different parts of the world. And I could, in the question period, I can go into how it looks, say, in Ecuador, how it looks in Nigeria, compared to how it's playing out in the US today. But we can see, coming back to Wolin, that the shift in the zeitgeist, Wolin argues that in the aftermath of September 11th, the American citizen was propelled into the realm of mythology, a new and different dimension of being, unworldly, where occult forces were bent on destroying a world that had been created for the children of light, unquote. And this opens up the space for a remarkable rapid transformation of the evangelical landscape, bringing a crowd of what I call kind of radical fringe elements. They're radical and heterodox theologically, right? So they're not part of a mainstream evangelical sort of theology, as well as fringe right politically, into the center of public discourse, and now actually even into the halls of actual power, which blew my mind. I was really interested in them as a kind of weird, American version of stuff I'd seen in Africa, which makes a completely different kind of sense there. And then I discovered they're like on, Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board, and they've established POTUS Shield, and I'm like pinching. And so I'm going to start with a leading quote, which Wolin opens his first chapter of Democracy Incorporated. And it's a chapter called Myth in the Making. And it's from a New York Times article from September 12, 2003, on a 9/11 commemoration ceremony in D.C., 2 years after the attack. And so here's the quote. Robert S. Mueller, director of the FBI, and Secretary of State Powell read from the Bible. Mr. Mueller's theme was good versus evil. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, he said, reading from Ephesians 6:12-18. So that has kind of weirdly prophetic resonance today in many ways. But I'm sure Bob Mueller was simply expressing a developing trope that saw political discourse becoming increasingly couched in terms of moral absolutes, a new discourse of evil, certainly the shift to portraying U.S. global politics in terms of religious, moral mission against the forces of evil. We remember the axis of evil. We remember the original name for the mission in Iraq, which was luckily dropped, Infinite Justice. Could there be any more theological political name? But it's also the case that these verses contain the central doctrinal watchwords of this new, most powerful form of evangelical geopolitical thinking, this charismatic paradigm of global spiritual warfare, and that those verses were circulating intensely in what's been called the third wave of this charismatic Pentecostal evangelical circles at the time. I don't think Wolin had any sense of this connection either when he was talking about the new myth-making. But he says these messages contain promises about the future, unfailingly optimistic, exaggerating, miracle promising, the same ideology that invites corporate executives to exaggerate profits and conceal losses, but always with a sunny face. The virtual reality of the advertiser and the good news of the prosperity evangelist complement each other. We have to think about their political theology. And he says, in their zeal to transcend the ordinary and their bodiless optimism, each colludes with the other. The evangelist looks forward to the last days, while the corporate executive systematically exhausts the world's scarce resources. So for the global spiritual warriors, for these new charismatic spiritual warriors, the nefarious works of demonic spirits are the real. And then you have to take this as literally as possible. I can get into this afterwards, there's not enough time now, to what they actually do, but they go around cities praying over demonically infested sites to free up the space for evangelism and the word, right? So they actually take the devil and his demonic spirits and the forces of evil as the real, as seriously as you can, and materially as an ontological reality. So central to this is a kind of new apocalypticism. Dire warnings about the demonic, fascist, cultural, Marxist, anti-Christian, anti-freedom enemy of the left, while using the very tropes and language of this enemy, right? So we have Alveda King and Harry Jackson, who's a black charismatic preacher, who draped themselves in the mantle of MLK, a popular apocalypticism that also has gone mainstream in the past few decades through the Left Behind phenomena. 65 million copies. I'm in the wrong business. LaHaye and Jenkins greet you on their website with, "Are you ready for the moment of truth? Political crisis, economic crisis, mass disappearances, military apocalypse. It's happening now." And in a Pew survey, it shows that in the US, 58% of evangelical Christians believe Jesus will return in their lifetime, and that the Bible is a good source of information about the future. So central to this paradigm of spiritual warfare is the question of the enemy. Who is my enemy? It's the most fraught question. And there's a different way to think about what you call political polarization, I think, and an interesting way of thinking about this creation of moral absolutes and the problem of the enemy, which was, of course, the obsession of Carl Schmitt as well. We can remember Michelle Bachmann crediting Obama with bringing on the end of days, and Alex Jones insisting that Obama and Clinton were actual devils who smelled of sulfur. And there's an awesome video of Obama giving a speech and sniffing himself to see if he can smell the sulfur. Reverend Rob Schenck, who's, kind of what you would call a mainstream religious right evangelical, who's one of the leaders of the religious rights war on abortion of the organization Faith in Action, tells journalist Sarah Posner that over the course of his constant visits to evangelical churches during the Obama years, he lost count of how many times he was asked quite earnestly, is the president the Antichrist? He called the religious rights approval of Steve Bannon's appointment a call of screaming alarm to American evangelicals that we must do some very deep soul searching, right? So I've been lurking for the past 2 years in this virtual world, and it's a vitriolic, homophobic, Islamophobic, and paranoid world in an apocalyptic rhetorical overdrive, right? For many in this extremely vocal and activist fringe, Obama was a foreigner, a Muslim, a Nazi, an enemy, less than human, the Antichrist, and their extensive media networks are saturated with a constant flood of paranoid fantasies. Muslim Brotherhood takeover, fascist homosexual plot to destroy marriage and the family, a concerted persecution of beleaguered Christian minority through the war on Christmas, Obamacare, secret plots to detain Christians in FEMA camps with the view to their extermination. We have a Colorado state senator, ex-military chaplain Gordon Klingenschmidt, I don't know if any of you have run into him, confidently declared that Obama is possessed by demons, and he'd exorcised him on his internet channel. The response, which is a massive prayer rally to launch the presidential campaigns of Governors Rick Perry in 2012 and Bobby Jindal in January 2015, is organized and funded by many of the leaders and stars of this charismatic wing. Alice Patterson, Doug Stringer, and Jim Garlow, who headed the campaign for the Anti-Marriage Equality Prop 8 in California, Samuel Rodriguez of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, erstwhile of the Dominionist Oak Initiative run by Rick Joyner of Seven Mountain Mantle fame. So that's another, what they call the New Apostolic Reformation, is part of this group of new charismatic networked Christian leaders. People call them Dominionists. I think it's a complicated question, and I can answer questions in the question period about what is this new form of Dominionism that supposedly is being promoted by the people of the New Apostolic Reformation. Lou Engle of Jesus Camp fame, right, is one of these central figures. The 2015's response featured prophetess Cindy Jacobs, who's one of the frontline figures of this charismatic program of territorial spiritual warfare and what she calls strategic level warfare prayer, and regularly raises people from the dead and influences major global events with the power of her prayers. So POTUS Shield is this latest iteration, and I can answer more questions about it, but it's this group of mostly apostolic, prophetic, charismatic Christianity who's decided that Trump has a Cyrus anointing and a breaker anointing, was anointed by God to lead the country against the demon-possessed left. And there's a ton of information. You should Google POTUS Shield. It's very edifying. There's a great book by Stephen Strang, who's also part of this kind of group, God and Donald Trump, who basically says that there's a kingdom shift happening at the spiritual level, and Trump is the man to bring it to pass, so that the diverse factions of the body of Christ will be melted into members' body that has been united through the cry to take our country back for God. The walls of separation are going to be torn down. And so this is a way of claiming the people for a particular vision of Christianity. So some of the theoretical implications, looking at the political theology of these groups, and of course I'm going to go maybe 2 minutes over. I think apocalyptics or eschatology is a critical category that has both political and ethical implications, right? It's both destructive and constitutive. It calls for the reversal of the old fallen world into the new, for the last to be first, for the transvaluation of all values, right? So if it's a call to read and heed the signs of the times, discern their relation to the promise of redemption as the overturning of the limits and suffering of the phenomenal present, it can take either the form of a positive political theology, which works on the side of imperium and provides a spiritual justification for historical political power and its constituted order, and I think that's what's going on here, Or, on the other hand, a prophetic, proleptic, negative political theology which works on the side of the poor, the oppressed, the last, towards a theological delegitimation of all constituted political power. If it's thought from above, as Jacob Taubes argues, from the side of power from above, as it was by Carl Schmitt, then the response can lead directly into the abyss. Schmitt's was an apocalyptic fear of the disintegration of the political and legal order, the undifferentiated chaos rising from below, leading him to a fascist, decisionistic, fundamentally anti-messianic conception of the political as a sovereign decision about the enemy. But at the same time, apocalypticism is and has long been a weapon of the dispossessed. As Derrida reminds us, nothing is less conservative than the apocalyptic genre. Apocalyptic says, let the world go down. I have no investment in the world as it is. In any case, in its original double sense of unveiling or revealing and catastrophe, insofar as it establishes a discursive regime in which absolutes reign, apocalyptics has always already a political implication, and often is associated with an anti-politics. The other second final thing I would like to bring up, and I can develop this a little bit more in questions, is the ways in which the way in which the style, the form of persuasion, or the epistemology behind the idea of global spiritual warfare. An insurrectional speech operating in the register of the performative, the rhetorical, or the propagandistics. A politics of agonism, antagonism, intolerance, and even violence. So in this opposition, the relation between language and truth is crucial because the violence of spiritual warriors is mostly affected through their prayers, prophecies, and testimonies. So it leads us to ask the question of the place, and this is an important question for populism, I think, of an activist, pragmatist, or performative model of truth for a political problematics of emancipation as well as a de-democratization. Opinions, doxa, are the very stuff of the public sphere. And that people declare them to be true and indeed insist that they are doesn't make them so for everybody. Public debate is oriented towards persuasion, making a case, swaying others to one's point of view. In short, it is partisan and often polemical and doesn't proceed according to a telos of consensus or universalizability as Rawls or Habermas and other neo-Kantian liberals would have it. Evangelicals know this better than most, right? The mode and motivation of evangelical speech taps into a transformative urge, a desire to convert the other, indeed the entire world, and recognizes the power of speech as a praxis that can transform ways of seeing, thinking, doing, and being. A power which is its source of political promise, but of course also its danger. Inasmuch as reasoned deliberation and liberal tolerance are understood as having been constructed as bulwarks against various instantiations of unreason, heteronomy, passionate conviction, and violence, the defense of liberal democracy and its civilizational values can only insist on reason as it pits itself against the unruly and increasingly violent encroachment of radical religion into a supposedly secular public sphere. Alberto Toscano, in his excellent book on fanaticism, criticizes a dominant intellectual trend in current responses to the problem of religious radicalism. Quote, recent calls for what we might term an enlightenment reloaded, urging us all to écraser l'infâme, to quote Voltaire, whether in the guise of Islamic militancy or Christian fundamentalism. The current force of the use of fanatic as a political epithet is linked, according to him, to the nostalgic and sloganeering turn to a certain image of the 18th century Enlightenment, in particular to its diagnosis and excoriation of religious intolerance as the principal motor behind political violence, social destabilization, and intellectual backwardness. But I think the liberal normative view of politics that pushes back against this is fooling itself. As Hannah Arendt shows, truthfulness has never been counted among the political virtues, and lies have always been regarded as justifiable tools in political dealings. A characteristic of human action is that it always begins something new, and this does not mean that it is ever permitted to start ab novo, to create ex nihilo, but in order to make room for one's own action, something that was there before must be removed or destroyed. Such a change would be impossible if we could not mentally remove ourselves from where we physically are located and imagine that things might well be different from what they actually are. In other words, the deliberate denial of factual truth, the ability to lie, and the capacity to change facts and the ability to act are interconnected. They owe their existence to the same source, imagination. It is by no means a matter, of course, that we can say the sun shines when it is actually raining, unquote. That's Hannah Arendt, sorry. As Trump did in speaking in his inauguration. He said the sun was shining when it was actually raining. So this ability to change facts into alternative ones indicates that while we're well equipped for the world, essentially as well as mentally, we are not fitted or embedded into it as one of its inalienable parts, says Arendt. We are free to change the world and to start something new in it. Without this ability to say, to deny or affirm something, to say yes or no, not just to statements or propositions, but to things as they are given, beyond agreement or disagreement, no action would be possible. And action, of course, is the stuff that politics is made of. But organized lying always tends to destroy whatever it decided to negate, right? The difference between the traditional lie and the modern lie will more often amount to the difference between hiding and destroying, right? The result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lies will now be accepted as truth and the truth will be defamed as lies, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world is destroyed, right? And this is the end of the common shared world, and for her, it's the end of democratic politics altogether. I will stop there.
Thank you.
Professor Cohen.
Okay, in a follow-up to our joint piece in Consolations on Populism, Civil Society, and Religion, Andrew Arado addressed in a blog post, but the rise of authoritarian populist governments. Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Primarily in post-communist new democracies in Eastern Europe and Russia. His goal was to account for the interests of increasingly authoritarian populist executives in constitutional reform, or the full replacement of the Constitution, and their efforts to stack, especially constitutional courts, and their claims to embody the constituent power of the people as justification. Such claims, paradoxically, are meant to demonstrate superior democratic legitimacy compared to defenders of liberal democratic as opposed to illiberal democracies, aka authoritarianism. Challenging not only liberal and Republican constitutionalist principles, the rule of law, guarantees of equal rights to all, the separation of powers, the independence of courts and the media, but also basic democratic norms of political equality, plurality, alternation, legitimacy of opposition, compromise, and inclusion, these tendencies towards the deconsolidation of constitutional democracy by elected populist governments are clear, and one may well wonder whether it makes sense to think in terms of regime change in these contexts. Things are not so dramatic yet in the US or Western Europe, but the structural and contextual conditions enabling populist mobilization and electoral success are there as well, and the warning signs make it clear that the old democracies are ripe for authoritarian populism. I'm using the word authoritarian populism now, which can include left or right, but in light of the rest of the earlier discussion. So that's my word now, authoritarian populists. Where am I? So there are chances that the conditions are ripe for authoritarian populists to gain or expand the government power and put democracy at risk. Donald Trump's accession to the presidency, his attacks on courts, the media, science, autonomous governmental agencies, and on the very legitimacy of the opposition, and the obstruction role of first of the Tea Party and now the Republican right extremists in Congress are sufficient proof that this danger should be taken very seriously. Here too, deepening social divisions are, with the help of opportunistic political entrepreneurs, being turned into a form of politicized segmental pluralism linked to a politics of scapegoating that undermines commitment to democratic norms and to generalized social solidarity in civil society. Authoritarian populism entails a challenge to democratic politics as usual, but it uses democratic means, elections, to eviscerate democratic norms, institutions, traditions, and slowly slide into autocracy. I will assume that authoritarian populist politics, you can see I inserted that word everywhere, are not an ephemeral transitory phenomenon, but an enduring risk and threat in all constitutional democracies, new or long consolidated. So it behooves us to think clearly about its contemporary forms, its logic, distinctiveness, seductiveness, as well as its causes, contextual features, social dynamics, and the problems that it inherently addresses. We must try to understand why there is a significant support for authoritarian populist parties and movements among certain segments of the population at certain times, and I'm going to focus on in consolidated democracies, America. I think that anxieties about status, honor, and social solidarity in context of profound political, socioeconomic, and cultural transformation, are the key to the politics of resentment fomented by authoritarian political entrepreneurs based on such anxieties. But unlike Hofstadter's classic and once highly influential analysis of populism in terms of irrational and rearguard status anxieties, which he counterposed to rational class interest, I think it's wrong to cast the issue of status honor in that way. Instead, I see social status, cultural and social hierarchies, and identity issues as bound up with class, although they are irreducible to material interests. Moreover, anxiety about declining social status linked to shifts in cultural frameworks and socioeconomic life worlds is intimately related to doubts about society-wide social solidarity and about the representativeness and receptivity of elected political elites to the needs and concerns of certain sectors of the population. Today, we're experiencing extreme economic inequality, hyper-social segmentation, and political polarization. This is a dangerous constellation when coupled with the apparent willingness of authoritarian populist politicians to disregard democratic norms of negotiation and compromise and to deny the legitimacy of political opponents. The coddling of political authorities of this type is also a very dangerous game on the part of established political parties, as Levitsky and Ziblatt argue in this book, a good book, How Democracies Fail. But I argue that analysis of the threats to democracy must also include a focus on the issue of social solidarity and status honor in civil society, in addition to behavioral and institutional analyses of actors and developments in political society, and also of economic exchange and issues of distributive injustice. This is not a matter of adding the cultural factor to material interests. Rather, it involves understanding the links between feelings of political exclusion and loss of influence, we don't count anymore, the sense of economic irrelevance and declining material and occupational security, we are peripheral, and the experience of disdain and contempt for certain forms of life that are becoming minoritized, no one cares for or respects us, and the experience and the evisceration of what were formerly sources of social honor. I'm thinking of Arlie Hochschild's book. Clearly, I have in mind those sectors of the conservative, religious, white working class, without a college degree, all right, in Rust Belt and declining rural regions of the country whose form of life have been under threat with the transition from industrial to post-industrial society. These are the population sectors now most accessible to the authoritarian populist frames. They experience a solidarity gap and a status loss that must be addressed by progressive Democrats if we don't want democracy to be hollowed out from within, because the habits of the heart that generate commitment to it and make it work are undermined. It's incumbent to come up with a counter-narrative to the friend-enemy version of politicized, racialized, religionized, and radicalized social cleavages so that the democratic politics of inclusion and cross-cutting solidarities and mutual respect and democratic norms can survive. Oh, I see. Okay. To grasp what's at stake, we need to be clear regarding the distinctive political logic of authoritarian populism. In the first part of a longer version of this paper, I do that, and I did this yesterday in the introduction. I won't torture you with that again. In the paper, I also take note of the structural factors that create the space for populism in all forms of representative democracy, modern capitalism, and cultural modernity, always. But context matters, and there are contextual features and contemporary changes in the modes of political representation, economic and labor markets, and shifts in sociocultural life worlds brewing since the 70s that have, I think, coalesced into an epical transformation. That's a contextual moment, generating a sense of crisis and threat experienced by so many. Together, these shifts generate three normative deficits in democratic representation, in material welfare, the oligarchy problem, and in social status, and very real resentments, including a sense of victimhood and pessimism about the future. So today I'm going to focus on only one element of this, the status identity dimension of the analysis as it relates to the politics of resentment, with special focus on religion and gender. The institutions of representative, constitutional, and social democracy are in crisis, and the deficits in responsiveness, accountability, and socioeconomic justice these entail must be redressed. But as I said, I'm going to focus on the social solidarity part because I think it's a third and autonomous level of structural and conjunctural problems that populists excel in framing and responding to. There are multiple versions of cultural modernity and different ways to frame and handle socio-cultural change as it intersects with economic, political, and technological transformations. So I want to hopefully desperately insist that there are alternatives to the politics of resentment that authoritarian populists inflame and foster with their backward-looking rhetoric of restoration of old social hierarchies, of declining socioeconomic industries, forms of life, and nationalist grandeur, and their scapegoating of outgroups for structural transformation. Those who want to counter that kind of populism effectively have to be attentive to the losses of social status and honor and social solidarity experienced by groups that were once far more central, but in ways that appeal across rigid and antagonistic identities and offer progressive alternatives. So, because we are in an epoch of virulent and dangerously, if asymmetrically, polarized exclusionary identity politics, and their appeal must be understood and confronted. As we noted in our Constellation piece, religion plays an increasingly central role in all this. Maybe not increasingly, but central. I don't know, maybe Kazin is right. Religious identity politics, at least, mapped onto race, class, ethnicity, sexism, rural-urban divides, linked together through the increasingly hegemonic discourse of the authentic people versus alien others and unresponsive corrupt elites, is becoming a key way to fill the empty signifiers of the people and the nation in authoritarian populist rhetoric. Indeed, exclusionary, anti-pluralist, racist, sexist, politicized religious nationalism is becoming if not the key host ideology, and hegemonic frame in 21st century authoritarian populisms that tap into status anxieties and resentment. So we have to parry all this stuff in ways that don't mirror the politics of resentment, but attempt to foster solidarity across what appear to be bounded and hostile identities. But we have to be careful not to fall into an appeasement trap. We should not accommodate status anxieties in ways that reestablish illegitimate social hierarchies and privilege at the expense of the equal rights of others. Different frames are possible, and there are even ethical resources in religion, as within secular thought, that can be mobilized in a counter-diagnosis and a counter-narrative of social solidarity, justice, and community, and hope. It's hardly an accident that religion tied to race, ethnicity, gender hierarchy, and locale has come to play a prominent role in American identity politics today. But religions are internally complex and have normative resources to fight religiously inflected racist and nativist populist identity politics. Ours must be a politics of disaggregation of the populist framing of an only apparently, I hope, consolidated and fixed segmented racial, religio-political identity on the right, and a mirror image on the left. So in short, our song, is Todd around? I don't know what happened to Todd. Our song must be solidarity, inclusion, hope, and expansion of the achievements of constitutional democracy. We've got to be a little more positive here, otherwise we play into the wrong side. So let me turn directly to the social status deficits experienced in the transition to industrial and post-industrial society by key working class populations, as noted by a number of superb ethnographies, well, whatever. Arlie Hochschild, Catherine Kramer, Justin Guest, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, compared America and England.
Guest.
Guest, okay. And Eribon in France. Sorry. They all show that it is the sense of being relegated to the periphery of their society, of not counting, the experience of sudden deprivation, and the lack of social solidarity on the part of government and political parties who paid no attention to their plight, that opens these groups to the politics of resentment. So there's no question that in the past 50 years we've seen major demographic, social, religious, and cultural shifts in conjunction with economic, technological, and political developments that undermine prior bases for social respect and create deep fractures along the lines of class, religion, race, generation, geography, and gender. I'll list some of these changes, but it's worth noting that it is not the economically worse off, the very poor, who feel the status solidarity pinch now and whose rage and feelings of exclusion authoritarian populists mobilize. They don't bother with them. Second, that while populism may fit the context, its offers have to resonate with people and hit on salient senses of injury and deprivation and demands, even if the way populists frame them is tendentious and destructive. And then there are other framings possible. So here's some of this stuff. Demographically, we're experiencing the most profound change since the melting pot area at the turn of the 20th century. Several people mentioned this. Nearly 40% of the population now is non-white, and children of color are half of all Americans aged 10 and younger. And since 2014, they comprise a majority of the K through 12 school kids. It's fine with me, but some people get nervous about this. Some of this is due to immigration. More than a quarter of Americans are first or second generation immigrants. Congress replaced the 1920s restrictive immigration laws in '65, and immigration skyrocketed so that people born abroad are now about 14% of all Americans, the highest since World War I. The effect is more racial and ethnic diversity concentrated for now, but not permanently, in urban and suburban areas. There are also profound shifts in occupational structure. 85% of adults over 20, oh, sorry, I left something out. In 1940, 74% of the employed workers were white and did not hold professional managerial jobs, and 85% of adults over 25 were white and without a four-year college degree. By 2007, the figures fell to 43% and 48% respectively. Well-paid blue-collar, male-dominated jobs in construction, mining, manufacture all fell from 1 in 3 to 60 in 1965 to 1 in 8 today. Rural and Rust Belt decay and insecurity, together with vanishing blue-collar jobs coded male and the destruction of entire life worlds around them, contribute to the emergence of a nostalgic and defensive rural consciousness. This is Catherine Kramer's thing. A beleaguered social identity that feels under threat and ignored, overtaxed, deprived of resources, and denied social respect. These groups no longer seem to gain from economic growth. Their organizational strength in unions and other civil society associations and local social capital and political influence in the various welfare states that once held sway throughout the West, it's gone. There's also a relative numerical decline, but these groups remain nonetheless a significant sector of the population. Cultural and generational changes play into this mix. Radical challenges to traditional sexual mores that have been occurring since the 60s, when women's movements reemerged, advocating equal rights to and at work, challenging gendered roles and patriarchal family norms, and entailing a sexual revolution and women's demands to control their own fertility and sexuality. These have had wide cultural and legal impact, and the culture wars over them continue today, in case you haven't noticed. Indeed, just as court-backed desegregation hit the schools in the U.S., legal secularism ended the de facto Protestant establishment in education by banishing Bible reading and prayer from the public schools. And this indirectly undermined, while triggering, the politicization and revival of religious justifications for gender hierarchy and traditional family values, as do the newer movements for gay marriage and equal rights for LGBT persons. These cultural shifts exacerbate status anxieties for those groups whose sense of social honor and appropriate social standing were in part based on living up to traditional family values and on beliefs about their superiority over women and people of other races and ethnicities. Cultural frames and shifts in cultural frames that enhance the social status and respect accorded to formerly denigrated groups like women, ethnic or racial minorities, or gays need not reduce the social standing of others. But when they map onto the decline in economic and material sources of social respect, especially the loss and marginalization of certain formerly lucrative and manly occupations, while raising the status of women, of those occupations that are peopled by women, the tendency is to feel a decline in one's own social status. Connected to all this is another epical change, increased religious diversity. And the U.S. prides itself on its constitutional protections for religious freedom and non-establishment and for a vibrant religious marketplace. Yes, as we heard from Casanova and others, for most of American history, those who identified as white and Christian were a majority, and there was a de facto Protestant establishment until the 1960s. Indeed, until then, 8 out of 10 Americans identified as white Christian. When Clinton won his second term in 1996, 2 of 3 Americans still fit that bill. Today, white Christians' share has dropped to 4 to 10. According to the 2014 Pew Religious Landscape Study, changes in the religious map since 2007 include declines among evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, Catholics, and a rise of 2 other categories: the nones, N-O-N-E-S, i.e. no religion, and non-Christian faiths. So religious diversity has increased, and the non-religious group is growing. Last point, how does race map on to all of this? Well, race has always been a salient category in this country and source of conflict. White workers have gotten the wages of whiteness since Southern elites succeeded in pitting them against newly freed African Americans after the Civil War and the abandonment of radical Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Revolution effectively challenged the legitimacy of racism culturally, legally, and politically, but court-ordered desegregation of public accommodation of schools, ending de facto Protestant establishment, along with legal rulings that legalized contraception and abortion, triggered a major backlash in the 1970s that led, as we've heard 100 times already, to the rise of the white Christian right and major party political realignment associated with the Reagan presidency and the infamous Southern Strategy, a concerted effort to shift the allegiance of white working and middle classes in the South away from the Democrats to the Republican Party by appealing to racism and Christian family values. Hostility towards racial integration and feminism, but racial integration evidenced in the sudden proliferation of Protestant academies, religious private schools throughout the South in the 70s to avoid integration, triggered that shift, or was part of that shift of white Southern evangelicals to the right wing of the Republican Party. Now, I know that, well, maybe I'll just skip this. I think, actually, despite the debates over race and Obama and all of this, there's been a racialization of partisan identity, such that Democrats are now perceived as the party of the non-whites plus liberal cultural coastal elites, globalists and multiculturalists, while Republicans are coded as the party of the common man, AKA the white working class, together with the successful white business elite. And some argue that race has become the core effective basis of deeply cathected party politicization. But race in a broader sense, right, in a racialization. So a part of the population, the white Christian heterosexual non-college educated non-urban traditional working class, is constructed by authoritarian populists as a political identity whose newly minoritized status is deemed unjust, and this, Michael, this is for you, because it's deemed unjust, but yet who really are the real people and the part that stands for the whole, and who rightfully insist on the restoration of their restored status against those who are cutting in line and wrongly favored by the multicultural policies of the political establishment. So the fact that they're a minority doesn't mean they can't be populist. On the contrary, in this case, they still sort of claim to be the true American people. Even though they claim, they have it both ways. We're the real majority, but we're also minoritized, et cetera, et cetera. Indeed, the salience of the adjectives, white, Christian, rural, heterosexual, are revealing. Narratives that structure class experience in the economic, sociocultural, and political domains as a matter of social status are mapped onto divisions of race, religion, and class, and now supply the energy for a form of group consciousness and for powerful and dangerous right-wing populist politics. Nevertheless, the inclusion of formerly denigrated and excluded social groups into a moral, egalitarian, democratic society, as I tried to say before, need not entail the reduction of the social standing of others, once relatively privileged, even if part of this objective status did depend on beliefs of their superiority. We can, vis-a-vis women and racial groups, et cetera. The success of authoritarian populists in aggregating disparate elements into an identity that fills the empty signifier of the people, working class plus white plus Christian plus rural plus heterosexual plus sub-rosa patriarchal, need not mean that this identity has congealed. Moreover, while social, cultural, and political economic trends do provide the context for the solidarity status deficit, there is nothing inevitable about the translation of all of this into the politics of resentment. So I argue that much depends on how these trends, deficits, anxieties, and demands get framed and rendered politically salient. I'm not convinced that the relevant social identities are so deeply consolidated or ideologically fixed that they cannot be disaggregated and reconstructed in ways that make cross-cutting solidarities and pluralism possible, or that they are immune to intelligent political projects and policies that address the solidarity issue, or that the politics of resentment is unavoidable. We can debate it, but I think the Obama vote by these categories is an indication of this. But you know, the Democrats messed up. All right. As we know, contemporary authoritarian populist politics in the U.S. have succeeded in framing these issues in terms of a politics of resentment, based on this distinction between the deserving, authentic, real, and traditional Americans versus the undeserving others coddled by the federal government and the elite cultural establishment. This does entail a friend-enemy logic, but it also entails a politics of resentment based on segmental pluralism and effective political polarization. I already indicated what I mean by populist friend-enemy logic linked to the construction of social identities that involve a pars pro toto logic and a dynamic of identification with a leader intent on occupying the space of power left empty by the democratic imaginary before. The difference between segmental and cross-cultural pluralism is also clear, as are the threats that the former poses to generalized social solidarity in civil society. Effective polarization refers to the radical, I think this comes from Mason, but anyway, refers to the radicalization of political antagonisms that follow from the overlapping of several social identities, religion, race, class, ethnicity, and their sorting into one political party versus another. Authoritarian populist political entrepreneurs do their best to map socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, religious differences onto one another and to sort these into polarized political camps, to foster extremist politics and to get into power. But what do I mean by the politics of resentment? Okay, I'll do this, that's cool. So I get it from, I follow Catherine Kramer, who sees the politics of resentment as arising from the way social identities, the emotion of resentment, economic insecurity, the sense of political irrelevance or lack of voice, and status anxieties interact, although she didn't frame this in terms of populist politics. In short, people come to view their insecure circumstances, and I'm quoting, as the fault of guilty and less deserving social groups, not as a product of broad social, economic, and political forces. The dynamics of scapegoating is well known and hardly unique to contemporary forms of populism. But the point is that the politics of resentment mobilizes not a political ideology or political principle, but social differences and status anxieties framed as deep antagonisms that are stoked and fomented and fostered by political entrepreneurs to encourage people to engage in a form of identity politics that focuses on insidious others, buys into conspiracy theories, embraces social conflict to eliminate an absolute evil, the enemy, rather than working towards dialogue, political compromise, inclusion, or mediation. The idea is to politicize and foster a situation in which cross-cutting solid attachment to groups are replaced by stacked overlapping identities. So effective political polarization entails not only disagreement with the politics of a party political competitor, but ultimately and more deeply extreme dislike of the social groups that vote for and comprise it. What's there? Oh my God. But I'm not convinced that that the socio-political identity hegemonized by Trumpian populism is congealed or unassailable, as I've already said. So let's just, I think it can be disaggregated. Let's just take a very quick look at, so I think this identity is fragmented. There is a lot of stuff has been welded together that can be taken apart. So let's actually the talk of Vanessa Williamson, I don't know if she's still here, and the book that she did with Thaddeus Gospel implies this. So let's take another look at the so-called coalition equivalence phenomena. The groups comprising Trump's base are heterogeneous, as it should be clear, and their demands are in fact conflicting. The white Christian right do want government regulation of morality and are key protagonists in the cultural wars, and want government to endorse and even impose Christian family values, whatever they are, on the part of, on society. But others in this chain of equivalences endorse libertarian principles and demand small, unintrusive, limited government and oppose government interference in what they deem to be private moral issues. This means that support for the Tea Party then and support for Trump now is not synonymous with the religious right, although the religious right and evangelicals overwhelmingly supported both. As do the libertarians. There are overlaps along another dimension, however, that's important to note. This is the rural-urban divide. Those living in non-urban, non-suburban rural areas in the West, North, and South all feel their way of life is under threat, and that rural people are overtaxed, this is from Kramer, and unfairly deprived of resources, and that tax monies go to the undeserving. As Kramer insists, however, their rural consciousness is not tantamount to a political ideology. The average white rural working-class person is not ideologically committed to anti-government regulation. They are not committed to ultra-free market principles or limited government or even opposed to taxes on general principle grounds. They oppose taxes because they don't feel the tax money benefits them or goes back into their communities, probably with good reason. The correlation is not between small towns and less government. It's an artifact of a constructed political identity that takes up status anxiety as a social associated with rural consciousness and runs with it. Finally, there's another group, obviously, involved in this constellation, big business, corporate dark money, et cetera, corporate power, who oppose government regulation and taxation above all of corporations. But they also endorse, unlike the others, they endorse free trade and want to end entitlements like Social Security and Medicare and disability and unemployment that other members of this so-called coalition support. So, okay, obviously, you see where this is going. I mean, I think that the role of democratic progressives, liberal democratic, social democratic progressives, one of the roles is to attempt to, to come up with alternative frames and politics to disaggregate this coalition. The point is to do this without abandoning principles and commitments to other elements of the population. So I want to say, I guess I should be ending, but I think the task is to take the status issue seriously and disaggregate and reframe. And I think that certainly with each step, each element of this coalition, you could do it. So, for example, religion. I think that it's clear that that you can find anything in religion. You know that. You open the Bible, everything's in there. So, or not just the Bible, any religion. So, universalistic religious beliefs and rhetoric have in the past and continue to be mobilized and can continue to be mobilized in favor of progressive values. They can be invoked against reactionary religious populist identity politics. Progressive religious institutions and believers can challenge the hijacking of their faith by right-wing populist demagogues and ambitious religious political entrepreneurs. Since the alignment of race and religion, anti-progressive economic politics is an historical product, realignment is possible. The same is true of the alignment of religion and gender hierarchy and sexual orientation, one hopes. I'm a little less sure about that one. But indeed, I think depoliticization and undoing of partisan politics of any religious group or denomination can can be framed as a way of returning to the core principles of faith. Actually, maybe one of the reasons that the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are rising and the younger people are getting turned off to some versions of evangelical Christianity is that it's become too partisan. They think, what does this have to do with the faith, et cetera? So, you're the expert on this one, I'm not. But I have a feeling that in a Tocquevillian mode, that this partisanship is undermining at least the religious part, and turning members or children, younger youth, off. So, of course, it's possible to form interfaith coalitions with secular groups as well to combat racism, civil liberties. So, in effect, the strategy should be disaggregation. The same thing with gender, and I'm running out of time. And I would say we'd have to go through this with race. I mean, you can see where this is going. I don't have time to map this out in terms of every element. So, in a way, I'm not calling, some so-called left populists are calling for, they're calling for a return to class, and they're blaming so-called multiculturalists or feminists, et cetera, for having pushed the attention in the last 30 years away from economic issues of inequality and class onto some kind of multicultural. I think that's wrong. Being a 60s person, I am not ready to say that struggles against racism, against sexism, against all, whatever else, multiple forms of domination that are not frameable in class terms. I'm not ready to say, and I will never say, that these were somehow wrong and diversionary tactics. That was the old Marxist position. No. And I don't think they are the reason why the neoliberal global economic order and austerity politics and ignoring of the sufferings of the industrial working class happened. I think that's really wrong. This is a Nancy Fraser argument. I don't buy it. This is kind of liberal feminist skill. Why can't you be liberal feminist, radical feminist, black feminist? What the hell? I mean, drop this thing. On the other hand, as I said, I don't think we want to go into a politics of appeasement. So I don't accept the reductionist analysis of status anxiety and other kinds of wrongs. At the same time, I think we better start paying attention to class, not just to win their votes, but because it's wrong to ignore the suffering of these groups too. And it's, I hope, possible to reframe through disaggregation politics the status anxieties and real economic sufferings and inequality in ways that you can form cross blah blah coalitions. That's it.
Thank you. Well, I see the panelists have been taking notes to maybe engage in a dialogue with each other, but first I'd like to open the floor to questions, comments. Yes.
This is for Ruth. I was doing journalism on the FSL.
Were you?
So that's
Excellent.
an update. So I studied the history of the politicization of evangelicals and fundamentalists in the 70s, and it just took an enormous amount of intellectual and theological work to get them to the point where they accepted the idea of getting involved in quote-unquote worldly politics as theologically correct. And the gymnastics were extraordinary, that somehow the government had declared secular humanism official state religion, and they started it, and we have to fight back. Wild stuff. But obviously by 79, 80, 81, most of the work is done. Is there any sense among the people you study, are this distinction between the world and politics and God's kingdom is just completely collapsed, and there's no sense that there's a problem there?
Well, one of my problems with studying this is that I do not have a good enough sense, and it would take, I don't know what kind of resources to find this out, to do the ethnography that would be necessary, that I did for 15 years in Nigeria, for example, to see what actually people who subscribe, who follow these charismatic leaders and who are part of their communities, which are not necessarily churches per se, but who've sort of signed up to this third wave way of thinking. Because as far as the leaders are concerned, absolutely no, right? Because now they're not even premillennial anymore. So the rapture is going to happen later. And then this is a really big theological shift. And the fights around this are huge. You can spend hours and hours, the disputes that happen online around, the shift even for charismatics, premillennialism, right? The rapture happens, and then there's the tribulation, and all the crap happens, right? That's the Left Behind series. But there's been a shift which says, no, the Kingdom Now movement is precisely, this is Peter C. Wagner and his ilk, all these people have been shifting, and there's been a real shift away from premillennialism, which I find striking. And I think
It's amazing.
yeah, it is. It's like, wait, but I don't know how widely shared this is in how representative it is. That's my big question, and I don't have an answer, and I'd have to keep on doing the research. But I'm not sure how much it even matters, right? Because the fact that there isn't necessarily a constituency that's basically legitimizing these people, they're making these, they're decreeing and declaring. They've taken on that kind of, sort of understanding of apocalyptic rhetoric and politics as decisionistic and as we decree, they're constantly decreeing. And they have a crap load of money. This is the thing that I can't, I started following the money, which is always a really important thing to do, and it's difficult, but they're teamed up with a whole crowd of really weird bedfellows, right? There's, old guard of the evangelical right, sort of Templeton crowd, the oligarchs, the Koch brothers, the DeVos family, and a huge crowd of free marketeering libertarians, neocons, paleoconservatives, and they've just mobilized an astonishing amount of capital. So Tony Perkins, who is not a NAR guy, but he's got Jerry Boykin, who totally is. He's got a whole crowd. There's this weird melding and a shift that happens. So it's partly, I'm interested in the political theology of it. And this was something that was really fringe and out there. And Fuller kicked out Wagner and his people in the 80s because they were just the Signs and Wonders thing was just too weird. And all the demonic stuff was just too weird. But it's become very much part of, I don't know if it's for strategic reasons or if it's just seeped in. It's certainly hugely important in the global South, right? And so, but it resonates radically differently in a country where there are actually witches, and witchcraft is a huge problem for politics, and you have to deal with them, right? So in a place like Nigeria or South Africa, it means something else. Whereas in America, it's a very different story, and I find it stunning, quite frankly. So I don't think there is anymore. And I don't think the fact that maybe people don't feel this way matters.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. I want to commend Jean's comradely, I use that in an apolitical way, of use of authoritarian populism. And just to underscore your point about the potential instability of the Trump coalition, if you look at the polls, about 20% of Trump's voters seem unhappy with him. That's a lot of voters, and that changes things quite a lot. I have two questions. One is to Ruth, which is I'd just love you to talk a bit about the racial divisions among Pentecostals, that the original Pentecostal revival, the Azusa Street, was multiracial. It was extraordinary how anti-racist it was. And if I got the dates right, around the 20s is when they divided into white and black. And now, if you look at, say, the Church of God in Christ, which is the largest African-American Pentecostal denomination, they're more conservative to some degree, particularly on gay marriage, than some of the other African-American churches have become. But a lot of this group is still resolutely anti-Trump, resolutely non-conservative. And I am very influenced on this by Sheryl Sanders herself, both a scholar and a progressive Pentecostal. So how does race factor into this? And then a question everybody, probably to Ruth and Mike. In a way, listening to your excellent presentation, Mike, we can sort of look at the 50s as anti-communism takes the lead, and religion is a kind of subset of a larger anti-communist movement. Religion becomes more central in the late 70s and 80s. Now you have ethno-nationalism, well, I'll use that for lack of a better term, or let's just say nationalism, going to the fore. What I'm curious about is if you have any view on whether the nationalism is going to replace religion, and that religion is is receding as part of this, and indeed, are the religious conservatives themselves being very affected, some might say infected, by this wave of nationalism? Thank you, and thanks for the presentations.
Also, the race question is complicated. And I think it's still the case. These guys are very vocal and very present, but I don't think, partly because they don't create these institutions. They don't have mega churches. They really are like these itinerant, networked characters who are very publicly vocal and speak for all, all evangelicals without any kind of mandate to do so. So the old forms, because they have this institutional sort of ground, are still important. And so I think, for example, African American Pentecostals are still not going to vote for someone like Donald Trump. And I did a lot of research amongst Nigerian immigrant communities who are doing reverse mission. That is to say that they're re-evangelizing the fallen America, right? And there's a huge movement. There was a big New York Times in 2005, Changing the Face of American Christianity, which seemed to me pretty overblown, but they are kind of significant. And I know that something they don't do in Nigeria, which is to tell people who to vote for. I never saw that in Nigeria. But here they did. They were like, it's Obama. Like, there's no question. We're all cultural conservatives. We are, as far as gay marriage is concerned, abortion, all of these issues, on the culture wars questions, they are definitely on the side of the Republican Party or the conservatives, but they would never vote for a Republican president because they're Africans. Right. And they know, and so race trumps Trump in this kind of case. However, the new group, this third wave crowd, partly because of their global outlook, because they're global networked, and also they are much more racially diverse. And gender is also important. I mean, 2 or 3 of the most important people in this movement are women. The prophetess Cindy Jacobs, for example. And Pentecostalism has left a lot of more space for women than classical evangelical Christianity or fundamentalism certainly has. This is also true in the global South. And they're connected with all these guys in, all parts of the world. And a lot of it comes out of mission experience that they had. And actually, one of the reasons I think a lot of these evangelicals got kind of Pentecostalized was because they saw how successful it was in their mission fields. And as mainstream evangelicals, they weren't winning any converts. And Pentecostalism was taking off in Latin America and Africa. And so they've got these connections. And so, for example, they're much less, they're lobbying, POTUS Shield is lobbying Trump for a more compassionate immigration policy. And they have a lot of Hispanics. There's a lot of black, Pentecostals involved as well. And so, and women. So it's not clear that I don't know enough necessarily about beyond the kind of leaders, about what kind of demographics are lining up behind them. But my sense is also there's a lot of young people who are really interested in this, which is surprising. There's a new book on what they call network Christianity, and it's looking at these groups. And I was surprised by this, the number of, because my experience of mainstream evangelical millennials is that they are not on board with the old culture war stuff. When I was at the Values Voters, I made a point of talking to a ton of millennials who were there, and also my research assistant. And they were just like, yeah, well, we're not, those are our parents' values. Those are not our values. Right. And so I think that is definitely a generational question. And then the ethno-nationalism, I think essentially, it's a global spiritual warfare, but it's also being used and very successfully used as a way of sort of, it's a diagnostic of what's wrong with America. It's given up its Judeo-Christian values. So this is an old story from the religious right, but also that it's Enlightenment rationality that's caused all this problem. And so Molly Worthen's got a great book, The Apostles of Reason, and she shows how and these guys are just like, no, throw all of that Enlightenment stuff out. We've learned from the global South, from being missionaries in Africa and Latin America, that the spiritual realm is real. And if we pray against evil spirits in the physical world, that's where our warfare is, right? And so there's been when we say mythologizing, it's really a fundamental epistemic shift, I think. And in that sense, I'm not sure how successful. It works to sort of say, if you guys buy into this story, that actually what's really going on is, this war in the spiritual realm, and that we can, by our prayers, overcome it. I can't see how that is going to solve, people's actual political and economic and problems. So I don't know how well it's going to take.
Well, Michael.
Yeah, I think I it's very informative what you said, and it sort of, confirms what I, my inchoate way was arguing at the end of my talk too. I mean, I think, as you know, EJ, nationalism, American exceptionalism, and Christianity were very bound up in American history. Manifest Destiny, and on and on. McKinley saying we have to Christianize these Filipinos when most of them were Christians, but they were Catholics. But he was a Methodist, teacher. But I think immigration, is such a key part of obviously the ethno-nationalist appeal, of Trump's appeal. No way he's elected without that, I think. And as you were saying, not just Pentecostals, but the Catholic Church, of course, is so multinational and multiracial. So are the Mormons, for that matter. Pretty much every church that wants to make it in a more and more immigrant country is that way. So in that sense, I think, and this relates to the question of populism and religion too, that Gene and I can maybe argue about it, but I think that it's very difficult to talk about nationalism and Christianity both in a defensive way and connect them in a way. It was not hard to do at all, I think, in the 1970s with a moral majority. And I think there's, because race has always been important in our talk about religion and about populism, about politics more generally in the United States. But I think now it's really a problem for people in obviously the alt-right and people who are embracing Trump, because they do have a problem with refugees, with putting up a wall, with demonizing immigrants, many of whom, of course, are deeply religious people. So, and George W. Bush, in his awkward way, I think, actually began to undermine that sense in the way that, to his credit, I can't give him credit for very much, but to his credit, he made very clear this is not about Muslims, it's about terrorists, and you have to you should not connect the two, and if you do, you're going against the American way, and that was very important, I think, and also, of course, pardon?
Who argued that?
George W. Bush.
Oh, Bush.
Right after 9/11. Yeah.
No, I just
yeah, and also. He, of course, was very different on immigration than Trump, and he was a born-again Christian, as we know, and that has a lot to do with it. Your colleague, Michael Gerson, the Washington Post reporter, who's a very serious evangelical Protestant. One of the things he hates the most about Trump is, I think, the fact that he's gotten all these evangelical white Christians supporting him, when he thinks that what he's doing is the most his dialogue, his character is so anti-Christian that it makes him vomit. Well, Michael Gerson's such a too good a guy to vomit, but he basically he has very elegant vomits in print. So I mean, I think that's a very good point. And that also to me is I'm more optimistic than some people. I'll just finish here. I think actually. This is a rearguard attempt. Trumpism is a rearguard attempt. I think now I don't know what's going to replace it, so maybe something worse, but I think like the Klan in the 20s, it's the frenzy of it, the hysteria of it, the Charlottesville kind of support and the kind of support he gave them is, that you can't sustain that, not just demographically, but also I think morally, in part because serious evangelicals, whether Pentecostals or others, are not going to support it, all that long. So that's my optimistic take.
Had the best line on Bush, as you know, the multiculturalism of the godly.
Yeah.
Brilliant description.
Yeah.
Of Bush was trying to.
So I want to just say one word on this too, because I'm a little confused about your timeline in
Yeah.
terms of the role of the religious, because. And also the distinction between nationalism. So in a way, what I thought we were talking about in a way is, so the bringing together of Christian and nationalism is a kind of identity politics that really is less about religion, less about belief than it is about identity. But the Christian part is very central to the nationalism of this. Authoritarian populist strategy. Okay. Okay. Well, let me just. I just want to. Well, I'm taking this actually from an interesting work of Olivier Roy on saving the people and other things, where the distinction between identity and belief. But anyway, so I'm not sure what you were saying about the 50s and the anti-communism thing, because you could also read that. I think Sam Moyne tried to do this. You can read that. I mean, we weren't just, the anti-communism of the government and McCarthy, this wasn't just framed as against, our economic system is better than theirs, and we have to, it was, where are the Christian people near the evil empire? This is atheistic. Remember, atheistic communism. So
I agree. I agree.
Because I thought you said that the Christian part, that the religion, not the
No,
religious.
I was
whatever.
saying it was a more ecumenical. It was Christians and Protestants and some conservative Jews too, all saying the same thing.
Oh, I thought you were
All
saying
the
it
same
wasn't
thing.
religious, because
No,
it was.
no,
I mean,
very much so.
A very constitutive part of that identity was
Very much
against
so.
atheistic communism.
The John Birch Society was
Suddenly-
very conservative
yeah.
Catholic.
And all of a sudden you had, all of a sudden there's a
I'm sorry if I
Judeo-Christian
misspoke,
tradition. I mean, that's a new one. But anyway, since the 50s. So if that was the case, it's more ecumenical, but in some sense, today, Christian can be code for, in the United States, for, Judeo-Christian, whatever, but I'm not sure if I see such a change as what you see, that's all.
I've got someone in the back and then the front. Yes.
I actually have the mic.
Oh, you have the mic. Okay. That's all right. I didn't see your hand.
Go ahead.
Dangerous
Yes.
for me to
Yes,
have the mic.
great.
All right, let me start off here. I just keep thinking that you all don't like to say Christian nationalism because it makes you think that you don't want to think about the 400 years of this nation where we had slavery and everything else, and Christians did that.
Yeah.
They did it, okay? So we can't escape that. We cannot escape what that is because people are involved in that project. And so the idea that, nationalism and Christian can't go the same sentence together, I just will point you to David Barton, who spends a lot of time writing about this stuff and is very much involved in the movements that Ruth is talking about.
David Lang, too.
Yeah, and he spends a lot of time doing this, and people have come against him, and this stuff sells like hotcakes, and it's in textbooks because he's in Texas, and it's now in your textbooks that slavery is just like, it was indentured servitude, okay? So this affects how we do history. So one thing to Ruth and then to the entire panel. Ruth, I was at Fuller when Wagner was there. Okay, so I can tell you lots about this. And they took him away from the class, which was a demonology class that was taught at the biggest evangelical seminary in the country in the 80s. They were casting out demons every day, him and Chuck Kraft. And then in the 90s, when I was there and answering the phones, it used to be, can I pick up a thing about church growth? And then it started changing, can I get his demons book? Because he had basically mapped the city of Pasadena and had all the places where there were strongholds. There was the Armstrong Church of God, all these places. He had mapped everything. And that's how he got started. So he was actually the first person that led the exodus to Colorado Springs, and then focused on the family and everybody followed. So I think of him as sort of a pioneer in a sense because he knew what he was doing. And so my question to you first is, do you think that this dominionist thing actually has changed the whole contours of and morphed in a way with evangelicals' ideas about being in power, essentially? Because, on the one hand, you've got dominionists who are coming out of a very Pentecostal kind of thing and saying they're demons. But on the other hand, you've got evangelicals who are saying we need to be in power. And those two things dovetail together. And this is why I personally think this is a mess right now. And you have to know a lot of theology to get out of it. The second thing to the whole entire panel is maybe Protestantism is over.
Is what?
Maybe Protestantism is over. Let me explain why I say this. I guess, yeah, but I'm really serious about this because basically each one of you had a narrative about something, and the narrative is messed up. Network Christianity messes up the narrative of mainline Protestantism as I look out over the spires of Riverside Church right now, which they probably want to fall down right now because I'm talking about them. But it doesn't work anymore for power. What is working is, the Catholics saying, the preferential option for the poor, or the charismatic Catholics in Nigeria saying, we want to join in with what these Pentecostals are doing, or it's all a mess right now, and what's losing is white Protestantism. And maybe the reason why we're having the problems that we have is that Trump has exploited this thing, first of all, but secondarily, for the Protestants that don't understand it and those good Calvinist evangelicals who don't understand what's happening, their day is done. And that might be the more dangerous thing to say in here, is that there's a populism that cannot exist with regular mainline Protestantism. Discuss.
I'll leave it to you guys.
Well, it's really, I hope you're not right, because I really do. But I am alarmed, I have to say. I am pretty freaking alarmed by this. Because I can see the politics of it playing out in America in a radically different way. So, for example, there's a guy in Nigeria, Tunde Bakare, who was the running mate of Buhari, who's now in power. In the previous election, he didn't get picked the second time because another Pentecostal pastor who was the kingmaker in Nigeria now, Adeboye, decided it was one of his pastors who was going to be the running mate. In any case, he's one of these apostolic prophetic characters. But his take on, the war against the enemy and the demonic powers is to organize, democratic mobilization to get out the vote, to organize Occupy Nigeria, to work with the trade union leaders, to do the rallies against the removal of the fuel subsidy, to see the state and the government and corruption as the enemy, right? So there's the theology itself, just like evangelical Christianity, doesn't have a politics written into it. It's ambivalent. And it can play out. And I saw this in Ecuador when I went to this Pentecostal / conference / I don't know what, it's weird. As academics, but also a lot of praying and whatnot. And they were, doing eco-theology and feminist theology and anti-imperialist talk. It was like, whoa, a weird kind of new liberation theology with a Pentecostal spin on it, which I hadn't expected at all. So again, I'm ambivalent about it globally. I'm not sure that it's, America likes to think that it actually sets the tone for these things everywhere. And these guys like Wagner and so on think that they really count, but Nigerians don't know who they are, and they don't care. And actually the money, in terms of the global story, is going now from south to north. So the global flows of money, capital, coming from, Pentecostal or charismatic Christians are going now from south to north, which most Americans just don't have the vaguest clue about, right? They don't need America. They use these tropes, these ideas, these discourses circulate, they get put to work. In America, though, I would say that, your question about needing to be in power, well, look, they're really, this sort of new dominion, I don't really like the term because, the seven mountain mantle, for those of you who don't know what it is that the idea is not so much we're going to take over the state, right? So it's not that kind of Christian version of Islamism or something. It's that we are going to get our people in control of the seven mountains, which are media, business, family, church. Oh, I can't remember, that's only 4, but there's 7 of them, and that's how we're going to take over because we're going to get enough of our people. So it's kind of a quasi, it's not like we're just, and that they're training pastors of their ilk to run for office. And they're, it's kind of this, trench warfare, school boards, local government, state houses. It's happening there, and it takes a long time. They're willing to ruin their lives for a generation in order to get it and keep it. So I think that's something that's happening. And they, prophets gathered at Trump's Washington hotel to unleash angel armies on his deep state enemies. This is yesterday. Sold out the turnaround.
It's happening. It's happening.
It's happening. The Fields of Heaven National Gathering. And Dutch Sheets, who's the main promoter, he said that we are the representatives of his kingdom government on earth. As such, we will expose the enemies of God, disrupt their plans, enforce heaven's rule, and reform America. We must realize that we are God's governing force on earth, and we have been given the keys of authority from him to legislate from the spiritual realm. So I don't know. I mean, to me, that sounds very much like we're, that there isn't, that what we need is power. We actually need to get power. And, right, so it is, look, it's Christian nationalism. And if you look at the connections to the really very moneyed anti-Islam kind of groups and coalitions, and Jerry Boykin's one of these guys, and they really know who the enemy is. And it's not so much in terms of race or in terms of, like, the good old white Protestant evangelicals full of resentment. These guys are not resentful. This is the other thing. There's no resentment here. They're triumphant. They're like, we're going to create the reform. It's MAGA with a religious, prophetic, apocalyptic overtone.
Yeah,
right?
but they're deluding themselves because they're not going to triumph, and they're at least in this country they're a diminishing group. I think. I mean, I think what you said. It was interesting about Protestantism in this country. I'm beginning to think Protestants are like Trotskyists, if you know the history of the left. That is, you know, they can keep splitting and splitting and splitting, and you know, as a larger group, that might be impressive, but they're not more and more presenting themselves as such a group. And that's more true of white Protestants. I'm not sure it's true of black Protestants. But a little anecdote about that: I teach a class once in a while on politics and religion. EJ teaches one too, and last time I taught a few years ago, I went around the room in the beginning saying, "What's your religious background?" The students and stuff, and not one person said Protestant. And I asked what denomination. When one was Baptist, one was Methodist, one was Congregational, Unitarian. I said, "But you're Protestants." They said, "We are." They didn't even know the word. We're just Christian, you know.
Yeah. Oh, they said Christian, though.
Yeah, they said Christian. Well, that's, you know, of course they're Christian.
That's interesting.
You know, but for them there was not, you know. Anyway, so I think just one quick thing, and I'll stop at the culture war stuff. You know, I think, you know, the fact that the connection between you know, populism and Christianity is in trouble is about gay marriage, obviously, which is now the law of the land. The fact that so much of this energy, at least from what I've seen in Washington, I don't do research about it around the country like other folks in the room probably do, you know, is focused on, at least has been focused on, you know, trying to make sure this gay baker, you know, in Colorado doesn't have to make the cake, you know. Now that is the very definition of rearguard action to me. You know, if that's the main thing you have to do, you know, and this case was brought by two gay guys who got married, you know, it wasn't, so it was defensive in that matter. Now, he'll probably win. I don't know if he'll win or not, but in the end, it didn't really matter, you know, whether he wins or not, because it's going to be, that's very definition of your trying to protect your minority rights, to me, which
Okay,
is not
I've
populist.
got two people ready to ask questions in the back.
We're,
and
you
in
know,
front.
we're having this conference and Billy Graham is being buried. And the issue of war, populism, and religion, America has always waged wars as crusades going back to the 17th century with the Pequot Wars and the King Philip's War, and morphing ever since. So the question, and this is clearly what Trump uses in the background when you're getting into these innards and baseball details of these different varieties of Christian theology. In the backdrop is that main theme in American popular culture, a crusade. That's how wars are waged. And I wonder how this situation we're in now is different than others. Secondly, the literature on false consciousness has been rich ever since the 60s. 2 years after the Great Society was initiated in the midterm elections, as we know, the Republicans started to counterattack, and all the backlash started. And I can think of books back then that dealt with ethnic divisions, the white majority, et cetera, et cetera. This has been going on ever since. The question is, economic stagnation, inequality has grown in America ever since. That's the issue that divides us right now. How do you see that in terms of what you're talking about right now?
Okay, hold that thought. I'd like to let this woman who's been patiently waiting ask her question. And then the audience can
Thanks.
Okay.
I just wanted to turn back to a point that Jean was emphasizing on the importance of status and honor, which we haven't talked about too much. And you contrasted that with the possibility of a class analysis, which you rejected.
No, I rejected the, okay, go ahead.
Well,
No, go ahead.
as the explanatory model, I think. And I just wanted to, you know, and I think one of the things we've heard in some other talks as well is the importance of creating an alternative narrative. And one we heard yesterday sounded like a kind of progressive narrative that, you know, sounded sort of theological in its secular orientation as well. But there's one detail that comes to my mind, which is that's related to this status honor issue, and the fact that people don't seem to be voting in terms of their economic interests, and we're really puzzled by, you know, how come people don't recognize that they're getting kind of snookered and all this stuff. And I think that there have been media reports in you know, coal mining communities and such of people being resentful of people getting welfare or people getting Medicaid and such. People are really, because it does perhaps undermine their status and honor. So I just wondered if people wanted to talk.
Okay, so
you
we
wanna
have
talk
two
about
good
that.
questions. Well, let's get the third
Okay.
one in.
Oh.
Go ahead, give her the mic. And then I'll let the panelists respond to whoever they want to respond to.
I'd love to just sort of build out that question a little bit, because I'm quite interested in as well. If there's a rear guard going on here, it seems like there's different forms of economy in play, and metaphysics and cosmology and whatnot, right? So I've been really fascinated by all the stuff about public monuments and Confederate flags. Like, why now, right? I mean, you could do this every year, or you could do this never. But to go back to this question of honor and status and class, I think that's a kind of lens for thinking about what's at stake for these different populations. Perhaps the moment of the kind of WASP is over, but as we know from the Civil War, right, Reconstruction can happen in a number of ways. And so my concern is that given a desire to maintain a Southernness or an honorific culture, that at some level DC is sort of like Southernizing the rest of the United States as a narrative, so that the wall too becomes a public monument to power in a moment when you don't have the population as the legitimating force for authority, right, which happens over and over and over again, but that justifies a minority, even on the international stage, positioning itself as who's in charge, even if you end up here by legitimate means, right? And so that it kind of generates a symbolic hierarchy of the honor on top of whatever the class dynamics are underneath.
Right.
Okay, we'll go to Michael, Ruth,
Michael,
and Jean will get the last word.
No, I want the first word.
You want the first? Okay, you get the first
You're the
word.
organizer, you just get the last word.
I know, but I want the first word because I'll forget what I want to say.
Okay.
Okay,
And I'm
go.
older.
Okay, okay.
That drunk you. It's very short, actually. I spoke too quickly, and it's a mistake. Precisely, I wanted to say, A, you can't reduce status to class, but B, you can't separate their interact. And I would also add political standing and influence as well. So it's political, economic, and social. Okay, so I don't think you can reduce it. I'm against this kind of.
Sounds
you
like
know,
Weber,
It's just a
class
matter.
status party.
Duh. It's exactly. But so again, it's not. I'm against reductionism. So it's not a question of redistributing, because actually, if you ask in the areas that you're talking about, it's not about wanting more money. It's wanting a good damn job, and so I can have my self-respect, etc. And because we haven't invested in retraining and all that stuff, or whatever intelligent social democratic, for me, economic social policy would be, we haven't done it. So the point is not that I exactly against the Hofstadter. I can't even say
Hofstadterian.
Hofstadter is right, Aryan. That approach in the 50s, which was also very much against social movements that were freaking out about, fascism, et cetera, that actually opposed those two. From a pluralist consensus perspective, and Marxists used to do it, that I reject that opposition. But my problem is that so you might say they're voting against their own economic interests, but it's complicated, because what their interests, they have multiple interests, and I don't think they'd vote against, the kind of investment in their communities that would help them be able to have some integrity and dignity in work, and I don't think it would have to be, opposed to other groups necessarily, but that's a long story. Just one thing about what Michael said. Hitler was rear guard too, but he created a hell of a lot of damage. And so, I always think about Weimar. I think we're in a Weimar moment. It was rear guard in the sense that...
He had an army.
I know, but that's not the point. The point is that Trump could do... I agree with you. It's all rear guard, and the Christian nationalist rear guard, but it can be really damaging and destroy our institutions, as is happening in a long-term way. So think of the media panel we had. So I think it's rear guard, but I'm really scared, period.
I don't know who's
Anybody?
next. I don't mind.
Well, you can finish.
Okay.
I can just do a really quick, and let Ruth have the last word, because she knows so much. Real quick to your answer to the gentleman back there in the blue shirt about wars. This is one of the things interesting about Trump, is that, yeah, we're fighting wars, but he doesn't describe them as crusades the way George W. Bush did. Obama didn't even really either. But every war really up until the Iraq War, you could argue, the Afghan War were, I think, legitimized by American leaders when either explicitly religious or quasi-religious ways. And I think, Trump, as a lot of people have said, this is hardly original comment, is very much against that kind of manifest destiny, Wilsonian kind of thing. That's part of what America First, he means by that, is this, it's all transactional. We're not going to try to save the world, F-U-C-K the world, in effect, which is different, because the United States is still the most powerful country. So that's on that. Neo-Confederate thing, there's a lot to be said there. You have to go into the history of the alt-right, which Rick knows a lot about. There are a lot of people in the South who never, thought that the war was over. There was a fascinating reaction to Ken Burns' Civil War series, for example, where a huge number of people all of a sudden began carrying Confederate flags and trying to be neo-Confederates again because they were so pissed off at that series. And so it's been going on since the 90s in many ways, in that sense. And on the point that Gene made finally. Yeah, I'm scared. I think everybody should be giving money and campaigning for Democrats right now, or just campaigning if you don't have the money. But what I'm saying, rearguard in terms of the cultural base, I think that the cultural base is shrinking. I don't think that was true for Hitler. I don't think his cultural base was shrinking. I'm not a historian of Nazism, but now, the scary thing is where there's going to be this authoritarian populist international, which we haven't talked about. But I think that is, has a real, potential. And people probably noticed the CPAC last week, not Marine Le Pen, but her much more religious and right-wing niece, whose name I forget, Marion was a speaker there. And people in France think that Marine Le Pen is a moderate compared to her. And the fact that they invited her, is, I think, not a good sign.
Last word.
I just want to pick up on this point, because the talk I gave last year at the Institute, I talked a lot about the connection between American evangelicals and Duginites in Russia. And I've got a PhD student who's an expert on Dugin and has translated a lot of Dugin, and he's terrifying. And his eschatology is also, his geopolitical, it's a lot more insane even than the spiritual warfare one. His website is called katahon, which is the Greek word in 2 Thessalonians 2, which is the restraining power, and then Schmidt talks about it in the Nomos of the Earth. And it's a kind of old Russian Orthodoxy, old believer slash, Byzantine imperial messianism. Well, not messianism really, because it's anti-messianic. It's really terrifying. And he and Alain de Benoit, the French New Right. There is a weird international thing going on, and it's freaky. So there's that. But as far as there was a question, I can't exactly remember now. This is what happens when you go last. You don't remember the first question. But the question about, how this works, right? These characters that I'm talking about. It's the creation of these kind of discursive chains and tropes and modes, and in effect, they get taken up by a crowd of different people. And so, it's not so that. So it's post-denominational in the sense that they're reaching a crowd of folks who might still be going to their Methodist or Baptist or whatever church and are kind of integrating a lot of these ideas into their own way of thinking about their belief. And this is, how you get Pentecostal Catholicism or Anglicanism or whatever in Nigeria. There's no non-Pentecostal Christianity left in Nigeria at all today. But all the old denominations are still there. Even Presbyterians. I went for Easter one time, and it was the liturgy that and you're like, oh, this reminds me of, and then suddenly there was a Pentecostal interlude, and the guys came out with electric music, and there was, and I was like, what the fuck? This is a Presbyterian. It's been there since, the 19th century. Anyway, and one of the other things they talk about constantly is their social justice focus, which is really perverse. It's very perverse because what they mean by this is that there's going to be a miraculous wealth transfer to Christians from the rest of the world. When Christians are triumphant, and they talk about this, they have like figures for how much money everybody's going to get. And of course, if you're buying into their story to begin with, then sure, why not? Why not a wealth transfer? Why not miraculous? That's the prosperity gospel angle to this. So they're not opposed. They work together in this really nefarious way, it seems to me. And, you know, the false consciousness thing, I don't buy that as an argument because, well, the fact is that no, because people get something from this. I mean, certainly, this is the problem. That's Arendt's point about facts. There's nothing less secure than fact, right? And if enough people believe this and are willing to act in terms of these beliefs, then false or true, it makes no difference, right? That's just semantics.
Well, thank you all very much.
I'd like to thank the panel, and I'd like to thank the audience.
Yeah, thank you. It's really fun.